Good morning. Thanks for coming. I'm pleased that I see quite a few people whom I don't know. So we actually attracted some guests from the outside world. And there are also quite a few people from different groups from HITS, which I take as a good sign. It's a pleasure to introduce Gerhard Jäger. He did his PhD at Humboldt University in the mid-90s. Shortly after that, we met when we both were postdocs at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So from like 97 to 98, 99. Back then, he was doing formal semantics, while I was a lowly computational linguist. So we didn't really talk to each other in Philadelphia. He just told me that he gave up on semantics 10 years ago and considers himself partly a computational linguist. So now we talk actually to each other. And we met this year in April at a computational linguistics conference, and Gerhard was presenting work leading to this to this talk now. And I thought, since this work combines computational linguistics and what one group at HITS, the scientific computing group, is doing, I thought it would be a good idea to invite him to talk about this work. After being a postdoc at Penn, he moved back to Germany, did another postdoc. I think in 2004 he became a professor at Bielefeld University. At some point in time he also was a visiting scientist at Stanford, and since 2009 he's a full professor in theoretical linguistics at Tübingen University. So we are looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, also for the invitation. So as Michael indicated, so I'm going to report about intermediate results of a project which is interdisciplinary in nature.
And one thing I forgot, please turn off your mobile phones or put them into flight mode so that the recording there will be no interference with your recording. Sorry.
Yeah, this is an interdisciplinary project which involves problems from linguistics, historical linguistics mainly, and using methods from computational biology, from computational linguistics, machine learning, statistics. So the interdisciplinary nature of HITS should make it a very good audience. So I'm very curious to hear your opinions and input in the discussion period, and also this afternoon when I talk to the research groups individually. So from words to features to trees, computing a world tree of languages from word lists. So it's about computing phylogenetic trees, family trees for languages, and this is something biologists know how to do. So there is an intrinsic affinity between historical linguistics and evolutionary biology. Of course, this is no new insight. This goes back to the 19th century. So Darwin was aware of this. Every talk which has to do something with the evolution of language has to show this quotation at least once. So Darwin writes, the formation of different languages and of distinct species and the proof that both have been developed through a gradual process are curiously parallel. We find in distinct languages striking homologies due to community of descent and analogies due to a similar process of formation. The manner in which certain letters or sounds change when others change is very like correlated growth. The frequent presence of rudiments both in language and in species is still more remarkable. Languages like organic beings can be classed in groups and under groups, and they can be classed either naturally according to descent or artificially by other characters. Dominant languages and dialects spread widely and lead to the gradual extinction of other tongues. So Darwin basically says all the mechanisms which he discovered together with Wallace about the origin of species also apply to languages. mutatis mutandis. So you can push this analogy further. What supposedly led to Darwin's discovery of evolution was the variation in the shape of the beaks of certain finches. Everybody has seen this, and a similar case can be made if you compare related languages. So here you see the first line of the Our Father in 4 Germanic languages, so in German, in Dutch, English, and I think it's Danish or Swedish, I'm actually not sure. So 4 closely related languages, and you recognize this is the same text. These languages are very similar, but they are not identical, and the most natural explanation for this variation on the basis of a similarity is that these languages emerge from the same mother tongue, from the same origin, and this structure can be visualized in the shape of a tree, both in biology when we talk about species and for languages. So here you see a tree of certain finches with different beak forms, and this would be a tree of the Germanic languages, where you have the East Germanic, North Germanic, West Germanic languages, which further split up. So again, we find a similar structure here, a similar approach to explain synchronous, so current variation by coming up with a historical explanation. Sometimes, rarely, in both fields, we also get something like a longitudinal or vertical cut, so an observation of a line of descent. So for instance, here in biology we have fossils, and we can follow the evolution of, let's say, the recent horse from older forms. And sometimes we can also find documents for historical developments of languages. So when we start with the German, Unser Vater im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name, then we can trace this back to Middle High German. Sorry that these headings are in German. So Middle High German, Old High German, and Gothic. Gothic is not direct ancestor, but it's very close to an ancestor of German. But of course, this is very rare. We have this kind of information mostly for European languages and only for some of them. So mostly we work, both in biology and in linguistics, we work with variation among observed contemporary species or languages, and we reconstruct the history on the basis of comparison. The analogy can push even further, so some problems which block reconstruction in biology, like convergent evolution, also occur in languages. So for instance, wings and flight evolved 3 times, I believe, at least in biology. And you find similar things also in linguistics. So for instance, there is an Australian language, Barbaram, where the word for dog is dog. So apparently this caused some confusion when a field researcher tried to elicit, the translations of various concepts. But it really is the same word, and this is really convergent evolution, because we can reconstruct the ancestor of this Australian word for dog, which is something like gutaga, and which has nothing to do with the ancestor of the English word dog, which would be something like dogka in Old English. So it happens that totally different lines of descent come up with the same solution for the same problem. This is more a curiosity, but we also find deeper convergent patterns, especially if we look at grammar, for instance. So as I indicated, the major approach to study change over time, if you don't have fossils or don't have historical records, is by comparing related lines of descent among current observations. So this goes by the name of comparative method, again, both in linguistics and in biology. So in linguistics, the comparative method goes back to the 19th century, or even the late 18th century, you could argue. And the standard way to approach it is to identify cognates. So this is what biologists would call homologs. So these are words from different languages which can be traced back to the same ancestor, like the English word new and the Russian word novoye. So both mean new, and they can be traced back to a common Proto-Indo-European root. So Proto-Indo-European is the latest common ancestor of Russian and English and many other current languages, which was spoken sometimes between 6,000 and 8,000 years in the past, or English 2, Russian 2, or English water and Russian voda, for instance, would be other examples of cognate words which can be traced back to the same Indo-European word 6,000 years ago. On the basis of these cognate pairs, if we compare two or more languages which are related, we can reconstruct common ancestors and sound laws. So that's a very important notion. So for instance, if we have water and voda, so we have a D in Russian where we have a T in English. We find the same correspondence between, oh no, sorry, this is D and T. This is kind of the opposite correspondence, but we find the same TD correspondence or TD correspondence in other words. So for instance, the English word for the second person singular, so now in current English it's you, but in older versions it's thu, and this corresponds to tu, for instance, in Latin, or tö in Russian. So if a certain mutation has occurred in one word for one sound, then usually the same mutation, the same sound change also occurs in other words. So this is a difference to biology. So we have this kind of correlated evolution. So on the basis of these sound laws, of these correlated evolutions, we can explain change from reconstructed to observed forms and trace back changes to reconstruct forms. And if we do this in a recursive, iterative manner, we end up with a family tree like this one. So this would be very flowery illustration of the Indo-European language tree. So this language family which encompasses most European languages with the exception of Hungarian and Basque, and also many Western and Southern Asian languages. So it includes the Celtic and Italic languages, Germanic, Baltic and Slavic languages, Indic and Iranian languages, and even more branches. This has been observed more than 200 years ago, that all these language groups are related, and this is the language family which has been studied most closely. So over 200 years we have a very detailed knowledge about what the common ancestor 6,000 years ago must have sounded like, and what kind of grammar it must have had. So here's a little exercise to give you an idea how historical linguists go about this business. Suppose we have the translation of something like 10 concepts, which are part of the core vocabulary of a language, into 10 languages. And your task is to figure out how these languages are related. I mean, you might recognize some of them, but let's make a guess. So who has a proposal? Which of these 10 languages are related to each other? Yes? INF, so do, trace, su, tu, tis, quiz. Yeah, this looks pretty similar. So we have mata, pita, dan, tan, odon. So it's not totally identical, but it's very similar. Other proposals? Yes? No? Not quite. If you look at the last one, E, do you see any similarities to any other languages here? What? Baba. Okay, that's a very good point. So this might be an example of convergent evolution. There are certain words which are acquired first, where the capability of the infant to produce words is more important than the cultural input. So like words from mother and father, mama, baba, something like this recur in language after language without having a joint origin. So we don't have too much time, so I just show you the correct classification. So sorry again that this is in German. We have Arabic and Hebrew, two Semitic languages, the first two. Then we have a bunch of Indo-European languages, and E and F, which have been suggested. These are, this would be Greek and Latin, so these are closely related languages. And then the last one is Turkic, which is not, at least not demonstrably related to any of the other languages here. But you get an idea how you proceed. So by comparing word by word, you identify similarities, and if you look long enough, you will also find recurrent similarities. So for instance, so we have thu here, for instance, so a th sound, which is written as a delta corresponding to I try to continue all the same. So this TTH you also find at other places here. So this indicates, this regularity of sound change. Okay, I skip over a few other examples because time flies. So by this systematic comparison, and not just comparing words, but also suffixes, for instance, of words and grammar in general, we can reconstruct grammar and vocabulary, but the bottleneck becomes smaller and smaller because the number of cognates between two languages becomes smaller the further we go back in time. And there's something like a consensus that this method cannot be applied beyond at most 10,000 years, perhaps 12,000. But 6,000 to 8,000 is actually a more realistic estimate, some people say. This method is hard to apply in certain regions of the globe, like in Papua New Guinea, where we have 700 languages on a very small space, which fall into something like 30 different languages. Also, the American Indian languages are very hard to classify. And another problem, which is also has a parallel in biology, is that we have a lot of horizontal transfer, that words are being borrowed from one language into the other. And on a shallow time depth, we can identify these loan words, but if you go deeper back in time, it becomes harder and harder to keep apart horizontal from vertical transfer. Okay, so now I come to the actual topic of the talk, computational approaches. So a lot of this comparative method involves systematic, boring comparison from word after word, from sound after sound, and systematically comparing many data is something computers are good at, and it seems a reasonable thing to try to let the computer do the hard work. There are advantages and disadvantages. So the disadvantages are obvious. You need a lot of experience as a human expert to recognize these correspondences, especially at deeper time depth. And a historical linguist who has spent 20 years of training brings in all their expertise, right? While a computer will only do what you train him. On the other hand, the computer is kind of objective, so it doesn't bring in preconceptions and can also detect weak statistical patterns which humans cannot easily identify. So the two approaches should be complementary. In any event, it should make it's worth a try to let the computer do the work for us. And in the remainder of the talk, I will present a particular workflow which we developed in my project in Tübingen, where we start very low, so really with unannotated lists of words, so-called Swadesh lists. So Swadesh was an American linguist who worked about American languages, and he proposed that we should agree on a list of 200 concepts for words like mother and 1, 2, 3 and you, water, mountain, etc. So concepts which each culture, each language has a word for, and use this standardized list of concepts to systematically compare languages. So we start with such lists, translations of the same number of concepts into many languages. Then we align pairs of words using methods from bioinformatics. So instead of comparing, DNA molecules, we compare sounds. This gives us alignments of related words. Then in the next step, we can use machine learning to automatically identify homolog or cognate words. And once we have these cognate classes, we can apply feature extraction and bring the linguistic data into a format, a so-called character matrix, which can be used as input to phylogenetic algorithms, so algorithms from computational biology, which construct a tree which is the best possible explanation of the synchronous contemporary variation we observe in the data. So we end up with a tree over more than 6,000 languages and dialects, so spanning the whole globe, so which goes deeper in time than the kind of trees historical linguists can construct with their manual work, because this stops at something like 6,000 years. Okay, so let's go through these through this workflow step by step. So first, the data we use. So these are not data I collected or my group collected, but this is an effort of a pretty large group of people, which was initiated at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, at least the linguistics part. So they are on the initiative of Sören Wichmann. So he recruited dozens of researchers who are experts on languages from different parts of the globe. They decided on 40 concepts only, the concepts you see here, very basic concepts every language has a word for, and they elicited translations of these 40 concepts into each of the languages under consideration. By now they have covered something like 6,900 languages and dialects. And the translations are all in uniform phonetic transcription. Now, professional linguists usually raise their eyebrows on this, because this is a very coarse-grained transcription. So here I give you two examples, the translations into English and Latin in this transcription. So this is not the standard way linguists transcribe sounds. It's not the International Phonetic Alphabet, but it's an alphabet which only uses 41 signs, all ASCII signs, to make this easy. So you can more or less guess what the different letters mean. So for instance, the letter 3 is an S sound, the uppercase S is sh, etc. But it's something to work with, and it's the same alphabet, the same transcription for all the 6,900 languages and dialects. The next step is to assess the similarity of words. And the people around Wichmann used what goes by the name of edit distance or Levenstein alignment. Many of you will have worked with this. So the Levenstein or edit distance is the minimal number of mismatches you find if you align two strings. So for instance, if you compare the English word hand and the German word Hand, so these are the transcriptions, then we will find two matches and two mismatches. So we have a mismatch of 50%. Now this is very coarse-grained, because if you compare German Hand with Spanish mano, we also have 50% matches, 50% mismatches. But of course, the English and German version, they are much more similar intuitively, because the T and the D, for instance, are pretty similar, while T and O have nothing in common. So it would be good to bring in not just match, mismatch, but to have a weight for how serious a mismatch is. Here's another way to look at this. I do have gold standard data, meaning word lists where experts spend a lot of time classifying the words into cognate classes. So I can use these manually annotated data to check how well a certain string distance measure serves to predict cognacy, and you see that we do have a signal. So in general, cognates, at least some cognates, have a lower distance than non-cognates, but it's very crude. And if you look at the data in detail, you find that using this just match mismatch misses a lot of useful linguistic information. So for instance, if we compare the German word zwei with the English two, both meaning two, then we know from historical linguistics that that's in German is actually cognate with the English T. So there has been a sound change in the history of High German, where a T at the beginning of a word changed to its sound. But if we do pairwise alignment with this Levenstein method, then this is being missed. Or Nase and nose, so the voiced z and the unvoiced are not identified as similar, or Latin piscis and English fish. So we also know that the Germanic F corresponds to a Latin P, so P and F should be aligned. So we miss a lot of information by just looking for identities. So the first step was to use machine learning to estimate the similarity of individual sounds. Our similarity, more in technical terms, is pointwise mutual information, or biologists call this the log odds. So they have a similar quantity when comparing amino acids, for instance, of proteins. So here, this is the only formula I have in these slides. So the PMI similarity, first we have this fraction, and on top of the fraction, this is the most crucial quantity here. This is the probability that two sounds, A and B, are aligned in such an alignment due to common descent. And Q of A and Q and B of B are just the probabilities of observing an A versus a B in a random string. And if you multiply them, this is the probability of A and B being matched due to chance, to coincidence. And so if you have the fraction, if A and B signal cognacy, then this should be larger, and if they don't signal cognacy, this should be smaller than the denominator. And if you take the log, then positive log means there is indication of cognacy, and negative means it's an indication of non-relatedness. And the next step is aligning two strings based on this similarity measure. There's an algorithm called the Needleman-Wunsch algorithm. I'll show you in a minute how this works, which gives the optimal alignment, meaning maximizing the aggregate pointwise mutual information. Now, this all sounds very nice, but where do we get this quantity from? The PAB, the probability of two sounds being due to common descent. So here I developed a heuristics. First, I used crude Levenstein similarity of words to estimate the similarity of words lists of languages. And then I used a very conservative threshold, which identifies only pairs of languages which are really very similar as probably related. So here are some examples of pairs of languages which come out as probably related. So if we start with English, for instance, all and only the other Germanic languages come out as related to English. So we identify pairs of strongly related or very similar languages, and then we pick two words for the same concept. So here, like for two closely related American languages, the word for one would be Nisam and Nishem. We align them as good as possible, and then we count how often two sounds are being aligned here. So we have NN, EE, S and Sh, A, E, and MM. And we do this for all the pairs of languages, which are several tens of thousands actually, and for all word pairs in total there are more than 1 million word pairs harvested this way. Then we can feed this into this formula, compute the pointwise mutual information, and do the alignment again. So if we compare two strings and we have these pointwise mutual information, there's a very efficient algorithm computing the overall similarity. So even so, the number of possible alignments grows exponentially. There's a polynomial time algorithm to compute the optimal alignment. So here, this would be for Menesh and Mensch. So this is Cimbrian for human being in German. So this can be done very efficiently. So we compare these 1.5 million word pairs, count how often each sound is aligned with each other sound, recompute the pointwise mutual information, repeat this 10 times. So this goes by the name of expectation maximization. And this gives us fairly stable pointwise mutual information scores. So they are visualized here. So blue means positive, red means negative. You see along the diagonal we have positive values, meaning each sound has positive similarity to itself, but we also find positive similarities between different sounds. I'm afraid it's not very well to see, so take my word for instance, B and P, or B and come out as carrying a positive signal for relatedness, or T and the TH sound. Or S and H, interestingly, so they are not very similar, but it's known from historical linguistics that S actually changes to H pretty frequently. So this makes a lot of sense from a linguistic point of view, and if we cluster the sounds according to their PMI similarity, then we get very reasonable clusters. So this is a grouping what linguists call the place of articulation. So you have sounds which are produced with the tongue and the teeth, or with our lips, or in the back of our throat, and the PMI similarity basically measures this point of articulation, meaning in sound change, the place of articulation apparently remains the same, but the mode of articulation changes. Now this gives us, so this modified notion of string similarity gives us a better handle on identifying cognates. So here here the upper graphic shows you how well Levenstein distance serves to predict cognacy, and this shows us how pointwise mutual information predicts cognacy. This is clearly an improvement now. I'm jumping a bit because I'm slowly running out of time. So the next step, now we have an informed measure of comparing the similarity of individual strings. Next step is to assess the similarity of lists of words, so of representation of languages. Very quickly, so if you, for instance, compare English and Swedish, so I take the translations into English and into Swedish of the 40 concepts, and I compare each English with each Swedish word, so I get 1600 string similarities, and then I compare what is the average or what is the level of similarities along the diagonal, meaning for words which have the same meaning versus words which have a different meaning. So these would be the two distributions here, and we see that words which have the same meaning often have a higher than average similarity. This shouldn't surprise us because English and Swedish are closely related. So there are several cognates in these two word lists which have a higher than average similarity. And by quantifying the degree of discrepancy between the two distributions, we get a measure of how similar the languages are or how distant. This has a nice autocorrelation with spatial distance. So we are clearly onto something. This is a genuine signal. So now we have similarities between languages. Now we can already use this to compute a tree. There are various distance-based methods to compute trees, meaning the algorithm estimates a tree which explains the pairwise distances as well as possible. I spent some time doing this, and then all my biologist friends said, no, don't do this. This is outdated in biology. You need to do likelihood-based estimation. And after some time, I convinced myself that this is really the way to go. So model-based phylogenetic inference is better than just, number crunching with distances. And for this model-based inference, we need discrete features. So I have to point your attention to how biologists do it again. So suppose we have DNA sequences from a series of species of organisms we want to study. We want to figure out what the evolutionary relationship is. So first, bioinformaticians do a sequence alignment, pretty much the same way I do it with sound strings, except that you have hundreds of thousands of letters instead of 5 to 10 we have in linguistics. And if we have the sequence alignment, then each column in this alignment is one feature in the machine learning sense, or a character, as biologists call it. And then we want a tree which explains the pattern of variation within this column. While explaining means assuming possibly, if possible, a small number of mutations along the branches of the tree. And then you can attach a likelihood to this column given the tree, and then you do this for each column in your alignment, and this gives you a likelihood of the entire tree. And then you can use all the standard techniques from statistical inference, like maximum likelihood or Bayesian inference, by finding a tree which maximizes the likelihood, so explains the observed pattern of variation as good as possible. Before I can do this with my data, I have to bring these continuous data into a discrete form. And actually, a lot of people work in this with this approach of phylogenetic inference, often people who come from biology, like Russell Gray from Jena, for instance, or Mark Pagel from Reading, and they actually start with this cognacy information because, as I mentioned, there are various databases where people spend a lot of manual labor classifying words according to their cognate classes, and what Pagel and Gray and others are doing is use these manual annotations, transform them into binary features, and then do your phylogenetic Bayesian inference. With my data, I don't have this manual annotation, so I have to find this information automatically. I mean, it would be possible to do this by hand, but this would be several years of work. You would need an army of research assistants, and probably the quality wouldn't be very good. And in general, it's a kind of a challenge to do this using machine learning. So this is what I tried. And as mentioned, there are a lot of good gold standard data, so collections of word lists where people give manual annotations of cognacy, so I can apply supervised learning. So I develop an algorithm which ideally mimics the criteria human experts use when making their classifications. So here on this slide, you see what kind of gold standard data I could use. Then I used a support vector machine. So a support vector machine is an algorithm, for those of you, if there are any who haven't heard about this. So it's an algorithm which takes vectors as inputs, labeled vectors. In the simplest case, just with two possible labels, 0 and 1. And it finds a criterion from separating the zeros from the 1, and then you can feed it with unlabeled vectors, and it will attach a label, 0 or 1. This is what I did here. So I have labeled data. So these are pairs of words. So something like Latin pater and English father, for instance. So this would be a red dot because they are cognate. If I would take English father and Russian отец, which also means father, then this would be a blue dot because they are not cognate. And this is what the gold standard tells me. And then I played around with various features, and it turned out that just two features give the optimal performance. So this has the additional advantage that I can easily visualize it. So the PMI similarity, what I explained 10 minutes ago, is the one feature here, and you see that cognates, so the red dots, cognate pairs tend to have a high similarity, not very surprising. And on the vertical axis, I have the language similarity. You know this method of computing the entire Cartesian product of string similarities, and then the higher the diagonal diverges from the rest of the matrix, the lower we are on this axis. So this is formalized as a distance. And we see that the red dots mostly are in the lower right corner, meaning these are pairs of words which are similar, which come from word lists which are in general similar. So this example I had in the beginning with the Australian language having a word dog, where English also has dog. So this would end up here probably because the languages are very dissimilar, even though this particular pair of words would come out as similar, so this would not be classified as a cognate. And here you see this is the decision boundary which the support vector machine found. So for the people in the know, so this is using a radial basis function kernel, which worked best after trying out several kernels and using Platz scaling to end up not just with fixed labels, but with a probability distribution. but these probabilities are pretty steep. So we have 0 probability in this entire region, then we have a small region of uncertainty, and then we get a high probability. And if you compare the two pictures, the gold standard data and then the decision boundary, you see that we will have quite a few false negatives and false positives. So it's not perfect. We cannot perfectly separate cognates from non-cognates, but it's a good approximation. Now applying this to the data from these 6,000 few hundred languages, so 200,000 words in total, gives us an estimate for each pair of words, but we actually want clusters. We want to see all words which are cognate to the Latin word oculus, for instance. So far we have a probability, how probable is it that oculus and German Auge are cognate, and how probable is oculus cognate to eye, etc. But we want to group all we want to form clusters of all the words which are cognate. And again, after trying out a lot of algorithms, label propagation, weighted label propagation came out as the most efficient, well, both efficient and giving the best results among many algorithms I tried out. So label propagation is a very simple and fast algorithm. So first, you represent your data in a network. So I define the threshold at 67%, and two words which have the same meaning are connected by an edge if they have a probability of at least 2/3 of being cognate on the basis of the support vector machine classification. Here, as examples, I have a few words for human being from Romance languages, and it's easy to see with the naked eye that we have descendants of Latin persona, and then these are words which come from Christianus. So several Romance languages have Christian as a general word for human being. And here's a connection between these two clusters. So person and castang have a probability of 87% of being cognate. And now label propagation works as follows. So first, each vertex, each node in this graph is a class of its own. And then you loop through the nodes in a random order, and you assign each node the color, so meaning the class label, which among its neighbors is most frequent and weighted by the edge weights. So here this would be so this here, the color of this node is copied here, and then we loop through the entire graph, and we repeat this in a random order until things don't change anymore. So here this is converges pretty quickly, and then we have two clusters. And in this case, these are the correct clusters. So we have the person class and we have the Christian class. In general, it's not perfect. So here is a larger collection of Romance words for human being, and you see that there are a few problems here. So we have this class of person, or derived from persona, from Christianus. But the words which derive from Latin homo, they are split across different classes. So we have ombra as one word, then we have various Italian dialects which have and then we have ome and omi in Galician and Gascon, and then we have omang and uman. So especially short words are hard to classify, right? So we have false negatives in the sense that it is not recognized that all these words derive from homo, meaning are cognate. And then we have homini, which is derived from the genitive version of the, or perhaps the plural of the Latin word. So they are kind of semi-cognate. So all this kind of information is not recognized by the SVM. Or here, another example, all words which come out as cognate to Latin oculus. Mostly this is correct. So all these Indo-European words from Germanic, from Slavic, from Romance and Indic languages, but we also find oko, which comes from Dorasque, an American language, and Ogo, which comes from a Papua New Guinea language. So we have, and on the other hand, German Auge would belong there, but it's not recognized. So we have false negatives and false positives. Overall, based on the gold standard data, this approach reaches something like an F-score of 86%, meaning on average, two words which come out as cognate here have, or for a given word, 86% of its true cognates will be recognized as such, and 86% of those which are clustered as cognates are true cognates. So this is not terribly good, but it's something to work with. And now we have the data in the shape where we can feed them into existing algorithms. So I already explained this briefly a few minutes ago here with a few pictures. So it's model-based inference, so we have an underlying probabilistic model. So we assume that languages evolve along a tree and that we have discrete features. In the simplest case, just 0 and 1, but it could be a larger number, but discrete finitely many features. And we assume that languages change between different feature values over time according to a continuous time Markov process. And the same Markov process with the same rates, with the same parameters runs along each branch. But if the tree branches, then we have two identical copies of the same process, which are stochastically independent. And then if you start with some feature value at the root and let these Markov processes run, then you end up with certain values at the tips or the leaves. And inference goes the other way around. So we suppose we know the tree and we have the feature values at the tip. So this is an example, the details need not concern us, about case marking systems. So if we know the feature values at the tips, we can compute the marginal likelihood, provided we have the parameters of the Markov process. But if we can put a likelihood on the model, then we can do statistical inference. So we can do maximum likelihood inference, meaning we can find rate parameters for our Markov process and the states at the interior nodes and branches, which maximizes the likelihood of the entire tree. Or we can do Bayesian inference. If we assume prior distributions on all our parameters and trees, then we can estimate the posterior probability of a certain tree and of a certain Markov process. Okay, so what are my features? And this is applied to a big matrix, and each column is one feature, right? Or one character, as biologists say. What are my characters? First, each cluster from this clustering step is one feature. So a language either has a cognate to Latin oculus or it doesn't have it. 1 or 0. And then I do the same for each cognate class, 25,000 of them. This doesn't work as well as I hoped, so I added another batch of features which are very flat. So this would be the back of letters model, the words. So I take each concept, like the concept mountain, then I have a translation in each language, and I take each sound class, let's say S, and then if the word for mountain in a language contains an S, then the feature has value 1, otherwise it's 0. This gives me 40 concepts times 41 sound classes, 1640 binary features. And you see that both these sound concept features, these flat features, and the deep features based on this clustering approach have a nice correlation with geography. So there is a genuine feature here. And then for inferring trees, I can again use gold standard data because there are many trees around which experts produce. So when I infer an automatic tree, I can compare this to an expert tree, and then there are ways to quantify the distance. And it turned out that both types of features individually don't work very well, but if I combine them in a so-called partitioned analysis, then I get pretty good results. So I'm running out of time, so I jump to the results. So this tree has been obtained by using the RuxML software, which has been developed here in this very institute, and which was the only software package I could find which can handle 6,500 taxa and 25,000 characters. So thanks for everybody who was involved in this. Very quickly, so visualizing such a tree is already a challenge in itself, so I'm not totally satisfied yet with this, but for now this is the best I could come up with. So the colors of the branches here indicate language families, only the largest ones are shown, but you see that language families are detected by the algorithm with very high reliability, and the colors around the periphery give geographic macro areas. Africa, Papuasia, so this is Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia, so the entire region between Asia and Australia, Eurasia, South America, North America, and Australia. And you see that mostly above the level of individual language families, we find a strong geographic signal. So Africa mostly forms one cluster, with the exception of Malagasy, because Malagasy was settled from Austronesians from the east, something like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So this is part of the big Austronesian language family, but otherwise Africa is very coherent. Then we have Eurasia here, the Americas, and then we have three, or actually, if you count the small ones separately, 5 clusters for Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea is the region in the world which has the highest linguistic diversity. The phylogenetic inference reduces this diversity quite a bit, but not totally. Also, if you're into this discussion about macro families, so several people have made proposals to go further back in time than the 6,000 to 8,000 years which traditional historical linguists can reconstruct. There have been proposals for a language family called Nostratic, which covers most of northern and western Eurasia and would go back something like 15,000 years. This is being discovered here. This is this group here, for instance. Or there's also a huge group of Southeast Asian language families, which goes by the name of Austric, which is also very controversial among historical linguists. Now, I'm a bit agnostic, so it would be great to say, well, I proved that Nostratic and Austric exist, but I am actually a bit skeptical myself because I don't know, and so far I don't have a good way to test this, how much of these deeper signals are really indicative of common descent and how much is indicative of horizontal transfer, meaning of language contact. And if the biologists among you have any ideas how to approach this problem, I would be very grateful. But so far this is open, but even if what we find at these deeper time, that's 10,000, 15,000 years ago, is only, in quotation marks, indicative of language contact, this is also an interesting finding which gives us a window into prehistory. Okay, so I'm over time, so very quickly, what are these trees good for? Except giving us information about prehistory. Well, if you have a tree, you can use it as part of a statistical model to study certain patterns of language change. So this is a study I was recently busy with, different case marking systems. So there's a long discussion which case marking systems are favored by cognition and by language change. And you can estimate the stationary distribution of the Markov process, which is implemented in language change. And this gives you a better estimate of the statistical distribution than by just counting languages, because individual languages are not individual independent samples, but they have this tree structure. And if you know the tree, you can control for this kind of dependencies. Or I'm collaborating with colleagues from Paleoanthropology, so they can quantify distances between populations based on morphological characteristics, morphological in a biological sense, so looking at cranial shapes, for instance, and we found very nice correlations between linguistic distances and biological distances. And this again, first, it's a validation of this approach, especially because these correlations also hold on deeper time depths across language families. And also this gives us a window into the deep past, and especially where linguistic and biological distances do not coincide, we have indication that something like language shift, meaning some kind of migration, must have appeared. So there's a lot going on. As I said in the beginning, the project is still underway, but this is where we are so far. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. And we should use the microphone.
So you mentioned about the historical texts, and also this method can be applied throughout the history. So can you extrapolate for the future, for example, to predict how the languages are going to interfere with each other?
I'm sorry, can I what?
Can you extrapolate for future by looking the trends, for example? Historically, there's a European Union and more interaction is going on, for example, for the short term, let's say 10 to 20 years, and what's going to be happen in the next 20 years, for example?
Not based on this model. So what I can do with this model is to estimate a Markov process, and then I can, of course, predict how it will develop in the future, but only in a very probabilistic sense. And if I go deeper into the future, then all I can say is that the red type, for instance, has a probability of appearing in with a 40% probability. So I can make little predictions for an individual language, only for distribution of languages. Of course, on the basis of my general knowledge as a linguist, not based on these mathematical or computational models, I can make certain informed guesses about, I don't know, that there will be more English loanwords, or perhaps not, or that we will get Chinese loanwords, and that the grammar will simplify in certain ways in Western European languages. So I can make certain informed guesses, but not really on the basis of these methods, and more on the basis of my general knowledge of linguistics.
Can you make any example?
Sorry?
Can you make any example?
So for instance, in German, we have a pretty complex syntax, like what goes by the name of verb seconds. So we, if we say tomorrow it will rain, in German this would be morgen wird es regnen, or es wird morgen regnen. So you have wird, so shall, or will is at the second position, and then the actual verb regnen, rain, is at the end of the sentence. And we know that English had a phase where it had the same syntax, but now we say it will rain tomorrow. So rain has moved to the left within the clause, and this is a much more common way of arrange words in a sentence. So it's pretty likely that 100 years from now, or perhaps 200 years from now, German will have a syntax which is closer to what English is today. So this would be an example.
My question goes in the other direction. From the from the trees that you already have for the languages, it should be possible to reconstruct ancestral languages. Have you done that, or like is that a common technique used for exploring historic languages?
So this would be an example, actually. So this is part of an ongoing study about these different case marking systems. So don't worry about what these labels mean, but these are different ways to mark subjecthood and objecthood on nouns in a sentence. And here, this is such an automatically generated tree, and what we know is only what current languages look like. And I can estimate what this is some ancient language. I don't know which one it is, but it might be Old Chinese or whatever. So I can make an estimate what kind of case marking system these ancient languages had. And this is just a snapshot, one sample. I can do a posterior distribution, so I can say with a probability of 80%, Proto-Germanic had verb final word order, for instance. There are some studies actually trying to reconstruct entire vocabularies. So this has been done for Austronesian, so which is a huge language family spoken in Indonesia and across the South Sea. And for the Turkic languages, this works fairly well, but these are simple language families, which are pretty shallow and very well behaved. For more complicated language families, this is still an open problem, but this is certainly something which is in principle doable with these approaches, and several people are working on this now.
I haven't fully got the idea with sound classes, so maybe you already answered my question, but have you also experimented with going beyond the symbol value? So you have 40 symbols you experiment with, but some of them are more closely related. For instance, the example of the voiced and unvoiced T. So maybe if a set of, I don't know, 10 features for articulation place could be more interesting?
Yeah, so I have actually two theses under my direction where people are playing around with decomposing sound classes into binary features. So it's still too early to tell whether it pans out, but this is something we are currently trying out. Yes.
On that, you could maybe also try to use acoustic models from speech recognition or something that directly model the sounds from languages.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I say I start pretty low as far as the pre-processing of the data goes, but of course having word lists there, this already involves a lot of pre-processing. So working with actual sound recordings is the way to go in the long term. The problem is to get hold of the data, right? Because it's easy to get these data for German and English and French, but to get them for Valpiri from Australia is a bit harder. But in the long term, this is, you know, like biologists. So what we are doing now is like biologists drawing trees on the basis of morphological features, right? And they totally move towards genes and amino acids, and the counterpart for us would be to use actual recordings. So yeah, I fully agree, but it will take another 10 or 20 years until we are able to do that.
So, thank you very much for the nice talk. I have two questions. My first question is related to the similarity metric. If you have two languages with different alphabets, so even comparing, for example, German with Chinese, is there a possibility to use your approach to cope with that? And the second question is related to dialects. French person speaking German, I'm French, living in Germany, and so you have possibly a kind of French dialects or even regional, you know, specificity with one language.
Regarding your first question, well, it's not a problem for the data I'm working with because they have been collected in a uniform alphabet. If we have data just in different alphabets, well, for Chinese, we couldn't do much because, you know, in Chinese you have symbols, each representing an entire word. But if we had phonetic, you know, spelling convention, then in principle you could also estimate the similarities. So by using something like minimum description length or cross-entropy measures. So you don't need to be able a priori to identify sounds from different languages. You could simply strive for the optimal data compression, and then this will automatically learn which symbols from the different alphabets have an affinity to each other. Regarding your second question, so if we have, so your example was a German speaking with a French accent, something like this?
Yeah,
so.
maybe it's exaggerated. Already in Germany, we have a lot of dialects.
Yes, and
Speaking with German even could be an issue, in fact, in the similarity. Schwäbisch and Bayerisch.
So actually we don't really make a clear distinction between language and dialects here. These are all doculects. So doculect is any linguistic variety which has been documented. And the distinction between dialect and a language is an artificial one. And for this kind of work, we actually don't have to worry about this. For the specific case where we have some kind of language mixture, like somebody bringing in French features into a German dialect, this is what creates the problem. So this is especially obvious with loanwords. So we have mountain in English, which comes from French-like. So Berg would be the Germanic word for mountain. And so these are non-tree-like signals. And this is what makes this task hard, because a tree is a simplification. Language change is more like a network, but estimating a network is statistically extremely hard because you have so many parameters to fit. So this is, again, an unsolved problem, how to adequately account for language contact for this horizontal transfer.
Okay, I can keep my question short now because you answered it, I think, mostly. I remember from my classes that John Breston, for example, told us that pidgin languages, they represent languages that merge somehow and develop a simpler grammatical feature system. So that would have been my question. It doesn't fit into a tree, so you need a graph. So is that not discussed in the historical approaches that you normally deal with?
So here in this study, and I think this is what everybody does who works with phylogenetic inference, so pigeons and creoles are just excluded for the very reason we know they will mess up our tree. But there has been recently a very interesting paper, I think it was in Nature Human Behavior by Martin Hasselbart and Damian Blasi and Martin's wife, Michaelis. So he showed with statistical techniques that actually creoles aren't so different from real, quotation marks, natural languages, and that probably there hasn't been a pigeon phase, but that creoles are basically ordinary vertically transmitted languages just with involving some relexification. But then you still have a mixed language when the words come from one language and the grammar from another one. Yeah.
Any more questions? Oh, yeah.
Just a simple question.
Wait.
You said you're not working with languages, but with doculects. So how many German doculects are you using in your models?
This is about 10, I think. Yeah.
So when you say German, it's a summary of...
Yeah. So there's Luxembourgish and Limburgish and Swabian, Alsatian, Cimbrian, yeah, so something like 10. Frisian, 2 versions of Frisian.
You compared, you said that you were comparing biological trees and linguistic trees, and that the interesting cases were those where biology and linguistics don't match. Can you give a few examples for that?
So one example would be the Negritos in the Philippines. So they speak language which is very closely related to Filipino, but biologically from their phenotype they are very different from the other people at the Philippines, and probably there have been, or actually we are pretty sure that there have been 2 waves of migration. So one like 50,000 years ago, which went until Australia, and the Negritos are believed, based on their biological characteristics, to be part of this first wave of migration, and the second one was something like 5,000 years ago. And the Negritos adopted the language of the invaders, but of course they didn't mix very much with the invaders, so biologically they are still more closely related to Australians, for instance, than to Indonesians. Or another example where we have a mismatch is in India. So we have linguistically a very sharp divide between North India and South India. In the south we have Dravidian languages like Tamil and Kannada, and in the north we have Indo-European languages like Hindi and Urdu and Kashmiri, but genetically there's actually a continuum. So, and we know from history that the Dravidians have been in India since thousands or tens of thousands of years, and the Indo-Europeans, so the Aryans, invaded like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And apparently the cultural divide has been very stable, but there has been a lot of gene flow between the 2 populations. So apparently people could marry into the other community, but then they had to adapt or have to adapt the language of this community. So this would be an example where culture is actually more conservative than biology.
I've read that there was a phase of mixture that ended 2,000 years ago.
Maybe, yeah. But certainly, so the biological division is much less strong than the linguistic division there. Hungarian would be another example, right? So they speak a language which has its origins in the Ural Mountains, so pretty far east. And we know that the Magyars invaded like 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago. But apparently the carriers of this language only made up something like 20% of the population. So mostly the Hungarians are descendants of regular Middle or Central Europeans. So Germanic or Slavic people, but they adopted the language of the invaders. Yeah, and generally in Europe you find more such examples. So like in the British Isles you have a lot of Celtic or even pre-Celtic population components, even though most people speak English now.
So one last question.
Thank Thank you. Because you mentioned Hungarian and Luxembourg, I'm curious whether, because you also mentioned geographic items, whether it's possible to look at the influence, because I happen to know that a dialect or version of Old Luxembourg is spoken in Romania. And of course, looking at Hungarian, you have to also look at Finnish, which are related, but I know that it's not possible to understand each other, as is opposed to, for example, if you know Italian, you might be able to understand Romanian and things like that, which is not possible between Finnish and Hungarian. So how does this is reflected in your data, or don't you look at things like that?
You could say something like after 1,000 years, I guess, if two languages separate and are not in contact anymore, then after something like 1,000 years, so it becomes impossible to understand each other. And probably I could come up with a number based on my language distance, but it's actually pretty arbitrary for these methods whether humans can still understand each other as long. So with these methods, I can detect a relationship much deeper. So for instance, English and Hindi, they split up 6,000 years ago at the latest, but the algorithms can still identify them as being related quite significantly.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then let's thank Gerd again.
Thank you.